You are not here by accident. We are standing at the edge of possibilities between what is, what could, and what will be. Where time, space, and humanity cross paths. Where the future has stopped being theory as old assumptions fade away and new realities are becoming real. Are you ready to step beyond the familiar? Look no further and enter the third horizon.
Before we begin, I would like to pause our journey through the human fault lines for just a moment. Not because we have changed direction, but because a thoughtful question deserves more than a reply in the comments. It deserves a conversation. One of the goals of the Third Horizon has always been to invite dialogue. Not agreement, not disagreement, but dialogue. Recently, a viewer challenged one of the assumptions behind this series. The question was simple, yet profound. Can individuals truly change anything when the system itself seems stacked against them? If institutions are corrupt, if incentives reward selfishness, if the people in power are themselves imperfect, then what difference can one person possibly make? It is an important question. Perhaps one of the most important questions any civilization can ask. But before we continue exploring the human fault lines, we must first answer something even more fundamental. Does the individual still matter? When I was growing up, my father repeated one lesson so often that I still hear it today. Son, always assess the situation. Before you react, understand. Before you judge, observe. Before you act, know what is actually happening. Years later, the United States Army reinforced exactly the same principle. Every mission begins the same way. Assess the situation. Not because assessment guarantees success, but because action without understanding often creates problems larger than the ones we were trying to solve. Over the years, that lesson became more than military training. It became a way of looking at the world. Because civilizations, like people, must first understand themselves before they can improve themselves. And that brings us back to today's question. Can individuals change history? Or are they simply passengers carried wherever society happens to take them? To answer that question honestly, we must begin by examining the strongest argument on the other side. Because it is not a foolish argument. In many ways, it is a powerful one. Imagine being born into poverty. Imagine growing up where education is limited, where corruption is common, where opportunity barely exists. Or imagine living beneath an authoritarian government, where speaking freely may cost you your career, your freedom, or even your life. Under those conditions, choice itself begins to look very different. It becomes easy to conclude that people are simply products of the environments unto which they are born. History certainly provides evidence for this view. Economics shapes opportunity. Culture shapes expectations. Institutions shape incentives. Laws influence behavior. And systems often reward some choices while punishing others. Political scientists have studied these relationships for generations. Economists have examined them for the same period of time. Sociologists have examined them. Psychologists have examined them. The ideal that our environment influences us is beyond dispute. It does. Sometimes profoundly. A child born in a peaceful democracy does not begin life with the same opportunities as a child born into civil war. A nation struggling simply to survive may make decisions very differently from one blessed with abundance. These are realities, not excuses, realities. And if we ignore them, our understanding becomes incomplete. But then the argument goes one step further. If people are shaped by systems, then perhaps changing people is not the answer. Perhaps we should simply redesign the system itself, change the incentives, rewrite the laws, strengthen virtuous institutions, reward good behavior, punish corruption, build better rules. On the surface, this seems entirely reasonable. In fact, much of civilization depends upon exactly this kind of thinking. Constitutions exist because of it. Courts exist because of it. Markets, contracts, property rights, representative government all attempt to channel imperfect human behavior towards more stable outcomes. Political science have spent centuries asking, how do we design institutions that encourage cooperation, even when people themselves are imperfect? It is a worthy pursuit, one that has produced remarkable achievements. Yet, there is something quietly waiting beneath this entire discussion. Something so obvious that we often overlook it. Who builds the institutions? Who writes the constitutions? Who enforces the laws? Who interprets the rules? Who decides whether corruption will be tolerated or challenged? The answer is always the same: people. Every system, no matter how brilliant, eventually passes through a human being. And this is where our question becomes far more interesting. Because if systems shape people, yet people also create systems, which comes first? The environment or the human being? Perhaps that is the wrong question. Maybe civilization is not driven by one force, but by two. Systems influence people. People influence systems, each continuously shaping the other, neither existing independently. Like two rivers joined into one current. The relationship is reciprocal. This is what the third horizon calls the agency paradox. The paradox is not that people are completely free, nor that they are completely determined. The paradox is that while our choices are constrained, they are never entirely eliminated. We do not begin life with equal opportunities. But history repeatedly demonstrates that unequal beginnings do not always produce identical endings. Why? Because somewhere between circumstance and destiny, there remains something profoundly human. That is choice. Not unlimited choice, not perfect choice, but choice nonetheless. And history has a remarkable way of reminding us what even small choices can become. And that is where our journey begins. Because if this paradox is true, then we should expect history to be filled with ordinary people whose individual choices quietly redirected the course of civilization. And remarkably, it is. And now, a word from our sponsors.
This episode of The Third Horizon is brought to you by CoinToss Coffee, a brand built on passion, family, and the bold leap into possibility. Every blend is handcrafted from Kevin's own recipes, including their best-selling cowboy roast, bold, smooth, and unforgettable. And right now, listeners of The Third Horizon can enjoy 10% off their order at cointosscoffee.com using promo code Horizon10. That is cointosscoffee.com. CoinToss Coffee. Take a chance on a better cup.
History has an interesting habit. It refuses to stay inside our theories. No matter how elegant our philosophy may appear, history eventually asks a simple question. Does it match reality? If human beings are merely products of their environment, then we should expect environments to determine outcomes. However, history is rarely that simple. Again and again, we encounter ordinary people born into extraordinary circumstances who somehow altered the direction of those very circumstances. Not overnight, not alone, but unquestionably true. Perhaps the greatest evidence against absolute determinism is history itself. Consider Rosa Parks. She possessed no army, no political office, no wealth, no institutional authority. She was an ordinary citizen living under laws specifically designed to deny her equal treatment. By every structural measurement, the system held nearly all the power. And yet, one decision made quietly while sitting on a bus became part of a movement that eventually transformed American law. Now let us be careful. Rosa Parks did not change America by herself. Thousands came before her. Thousands stood beside her, and thousands continued after her. History is not written by one isolated hero. It is written by countless people whose choices begin reinforcing one another. But imagine if Rosa Parks had believed my choice cannot matter because the system is too strong. History might have unfolded very different. Now travel across the Atlantic to Poland. During the Cold War, the Soviet system appeared immovable. The state controlled industries, military, courts, media, and so much more. Many people believed meaningful change was impossible. Then, an electrician named Lech Wałęsa climbed over the wall of a shipyard. He did not possess government authority. He possessed something else: courage. And what began as a labor unrest slowly became solidarity. What began as solidarity became millions of supporters. What became millions eventually helped transform an entire nation. Did one man overthrow communism? No. But one man's actions helped create conditions where millions of people discovered they were not alone. Then there was Václav Havel. Václav Havel. Not a soldier, not a wealthy industrialist, but a playwright. His weapon was not force. It was ideals. His writings question systems many believe to be permanent. For those ideals, he was in prison. Yet ideals have a remarkable endurance. Eventually, the man once imprisoned by his government became president of that same country. and then again when the country became two. History had changed direction. Not because one individual possessed unlimited power, but because ideals once shared have a way of spreading beyond their author. Then there's Nelson Mandela. 27 years, nearly 3 decades in prison. If environment determines destiny, Mandela should have emerged consumed by bitterness. Instead, he emerged committed to reconciliation. That decision was neither inevitable nor easy. It was a choice. One that profoundly influenced South Africa's transition. Mandela did not solve every problem. No leader can. But he demonstrated something extraordinary. Systems may imprison the body, but cannot fully imprison the mind. Finally, consider Martin Luther King Jr. He confronted laws, courts, violence, and cultural resistance. The environment opposed him. The incentives opposed him. The institutions opposed him. Yet, his message spread, not because every obstacle disappeared, but because truth, when constantly lived, possesses extraordinary influence. His dream did not instantly become reality, but it changed the trajectory of it. History did not suddenly arrive. It slowly began turning. Now step back. Look not at the individuals, but at the pattern. Different centuries, different countries, different cultures, different political systems, yet remarkably similar dynamics. None possessed overwhelming power. None controlled every institution. None acted alone. Yet every one of them altered the future. Not by escaping history, but by participating in it. Which raises a fascinating question. If environments completely determine human behavior, how do environments themselves ever change? But think about it. Because every institution, every constitution, every revolution, every reform, every scientific breakthrough, every great movement ultimately begins with human beings choosing differently than before. Perhaps history does not force us to choose between people or systems. Perhaps history is showing us something far more profound. People influence systems. Systems influence people. And over generations, their interaction becomes civilization itself. But something else becomes visible, something we often overlook. None of these individuals changed history in a single moment. their influence spread person to person, family to family, community to community, almost like ripples expanding across water. And perhaps that is because change itself follows a pattern we can actually understand. And now, another word for our sponsors.
This episode of The Third Horizon is also brought to you by FCA, Fine Consulting Agency. If you need high-level policy analysis, structured research, or strategic writing tailored for government, space governance, or nonprofit sectors, FCA delivers clarity, organization, and deep insight. Learn more at fcaonline.info, that is fcaonline.info.
History has now given us something remarkable. Not merely inspiration, but evidence. Evidence that human beings, despite extraordinary constraints, can influence the direction of civilization. But we still have not answered the deeper question. How? How does one person's decision become millions? How does a quiet act of courage become social transformation? How does a single ideal outlive the empire that tried to silence it? The answer, I believe, lies in understanding how change actually spreads. Because history does not usually move like an explosion. It moves like a ripple. Imagine dropping a single stone in a calm lake. The stone disappears almost instantly. But the ripples continue expanding. The stone does not touch the far shoreline. The ripples do. Human influence often works the same way. A choice affects a family influences a community. Communities shape institutions. Institutions redirect nations. And nations eventually reshape civilizations. Change rarely begins at the top. More often, it rises from below, not through sudden revolution, but through accumulated influence. This is what the Third Horizon calls the change cascade. We need to notice something important, however. In that change cascade, the person never disappears. Each level carries the previous one forward. Civilization is not separate from people. Civilization is people. Organization across time. But history reveals another pattern. Sometimes good ideals seem to accomplish almost nothing. Years have passed, decades move forward, and little appears to change. Then almost suddenly, everything changes. Why? Why is this? Because systems often possess what scientists call thresholds and catalysts. Water remains liquid until it freezes. Pressure inside Earth builds quietly until a fault line finally shifts and releases it. A bridge withstands stress until one final force exceeds its design. Civilizations behave much the same way. Ideals accumulate, trust accumulates, dissatisfaction accumulates, hope accumulates. Eventually, a threshold is reached. But a threshold almost does not always create change. Often, something must act as the catalyst: a refusal, a speech, a strike, or a march. A decision made by one person at exactly the moment when many others are ready to move. History appears to change overnight, but in reality, it has been changing quietly for many years. The third horizon calls this the threshold catalyst effect. Think again about Rosa Parks. She was not the first person treated unjustly, but her refusal became a catalyst. Think of Lynch Wallisa. He was not the first worker dissatisfied, but his action became a catalyst. Think of Martin Luther King Jr. He did not invent equality, but his voice became a catalyst. Each arrived in their own way. When countless unseen activities had already begun building pressure. Their greatness was not acting alone. Their greatness was recognizing the threshold. This changes how we think about leadership. Leadership is not the magic. It is not celebrity. It is not domination. Leadership is often recognizing that history has approached a threshold and possessing the courage to become or provide the catalyst that helps people move forward. This brings us to another misunderstanding. We often confuse power with influence. They are not the same. Power can compel obedience. Influence inspires choice. Power can command. Influence persuades. Power often depends upon position. Influence depends upon credibility. History is filled with rulers whose power disappeared the moment their authority ended. However, history is equally filled with ordinary people whose influence continued long after they were gone. Power may change today's decision. Influence may shape tomorrow's civilization. That distinction matters, especially when we begin asking whether one person can change the world. Because perhaps the better question is not, how much power do I possess? Perhaps the better question is, what kind of influence can I be creating? Now, something unexpected happens. Remember the 4 human vectors we explored previously. security, prosperity, identity, and meaning. Each begins inside in individuals, but none remain there. Fear spreads, trust spreads, greed spreads, generosity spreads, division spreads, unity spreads, purpose spreads, hopelessness spreads. Human behavior is remarkably contagious. The vectors do not simply shape one life, they circulate throughout families, communities, institutions, and civilizations. Suddenly, the four vectors and the change cascade become one continuous process. Our internal choices become external reality. And perhaps this explains something we often miss. Civilizations rarely collapse all at once. They erode. One behavior, one compromise, one decision, one generation at a time. But if decline spreads, perhaps renewal does too. Perhaps now we can finally answer the question that began this conversation. Can one person change the world? The answer depends entirely upon what we mean by change. If we expect one individual to instantly solve poverty, eliminate consumption, or redesign civilization, history says probably won't happen. Civilizations are simply too complex, too interconnected, too influenced by generations that came before. But if we ask a different question, can one person's choices redirect the future? History answers again and again with a resounding yes. Not because one person possesses unlimited power, but because influence moves through people like ripples through water, like seeds through fertile ground, like ideals through generations. History is rarely rewritten by one dramatic moment or the other. It is redirected through countless ordinary decisions made by ordinary people who refuse to surrender their agency. And this brings us back to the human fault lines. Because every fault line we are about to explore begins exactly here. Not inside governments, not inside constitutions, not inside economies, but inside us. Every institution is ultimately a reflection of reoccurring human behavior. Corruption begins long before it reaches government. It begins inside individual decisions. Fear spreads long before nations go to war. It begins inside human perception. Tribalism does not begin at national borders. It begins with how we decide who belongs and who does not. Leadership does not begin with elections. It begins with character. Every human fault line begins in the habits we normalize, the fears we feed, the compromises we excuse, and the choices we repeat. Long before it becomes institutional, it has already become human. Which means before we redesign systems, we must first understand the people who design them. That is the purpose of this new series. Because no constitution, however brilliant, can permanently compensate for a civilization that no longer values integrity. No economic model, however efficient, can survive if trust disappears. No military, however powerful, can defend a society that has forgotten why it exists. Systems matter. They matter enormously. But systems are sustained by human beings. Here on the third horizon, we often speak around engineered adaptation, designing systems that become stronger under stress. But perhaps there is another kind of engineer adaptation, not only adapting institutions, but adapting ourselves. Learning, growing, connecting, and passing wisdom to the next generation before the mistakes become permanent. Perhaps civilizations do not become extraordinary because they eliminate human imperfection. Perhaps they become extraordinary because they learn how to recognize it, manage it, and continuously improve upon it. That is adaptation at the level of civilization. So, where does that leave us? Perhaps with a far simpler question. Not can I change the world, but what kind of world does my behavior encourage? Because every conversation encourages something. Every law encourages something. Every family encourages something. Every classroom encourages something. Every leader encourages something. Every civilization encourages something. The real question is not whether influence exists. The real question is which direction is it following? Towards fear or courage? Towards division or cohesion? Towards corruption or integrity? Towards despair or purpose? Towards collapse or flourishing? Many years ago, my father taught me to assess the situation, The Army taught me to do the same. Life continued reinforcing that lesson. Look honestly, think carefully, and act deliberately. Perhaps that advice applies to civilizations just as much as it applies to individuals. Because the future does not belong to those who react the fastest. It belongs to those who understand where today's choices are leading tomorrow. History is not simply something we inherit. It is also something we leave behind. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of human agency. Not controlling history, but participating in it. Not possessing unlimited power, but accepting genuine responsibility. Not changing everything today, but faithfully redirecting what comes next. Individuals may not control history, but history has repeatedly shown they can redirect it. Next time, we return to our human fault lines, beginning with the first and perhaps the most fundamental of them all, which is cohesion breakdown. Why do human beings separate from one another? Why does trust disappear? Why do communities fracture? And most importantly, how do we begin putting them back together? Because every civilization that has ever endured first learned how to hold together, time and time again. And every civilization that has ever fallen first began coming apart quietly in the shadows of time. This podcast is not about blame. This podcast is not about deciding who's right or who's wrong. This podcast is about exploring humanity and the processes that shape our worlds. This podcast is about exploring the future that humanity can achieve. If you are someone who senses the world shifting, if you feel the tension between what is and what could be, if you believe humanity is meant for something more, then welcome. This is the Third Horizon. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. More conversations are coming, deeper, wider, and firmly focused on the future. If you enjoyed today's podcast, hit the like button, let us know in the comments, and subscribe to our Spotify, YouTube, and Facebook channels, or whatever platform you are listening from. And do not forget to share this podcast with your friends and family. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and beyond.